started. I think you gave it away, but does anybody know what the D word is? Democracy, that's right. Democracy. And you'll find out today why I call it the D word. Okay? We're going to start, though. This is a mock lecture. Okay? Normally our lectures are 90 minutes long. Today we have 45 minutes. So we're going to condense things down. But we're going to start with a brief group discussion. Okay? I really like to incorporate small group discussions in my lectures to give all the chance for students to interact and share their ideas with one another and not just sit and listen to me the whole time. So we'll practice a group discussion. I would like you to just chat with the people you came with or the person sitting next to you. And I'd like you to think about what is democracy. And I'd like you to think about whether you think democracy and dictatorship are like two distinct categories. You're either a democracy or you're a dictatorship, and the line between them is clear. Or do you think you can countries range from democracy to dictatorship, and it's sort of more of a scale, okay? And while you're thinking about that, okay, in a conceptual way, I also want you to think about how would you know a democracy when you see one? So we have these ideas of what democracy is. But now, if I gave you a list of countries, how would you identify which ones are democracies and which ones are dictatorships? So most of you, I think, have this handout. And if you look at the page that says group discussion, and you just need the top half for now, okay? There's these questions, and there is a list of countries. I've selected all the countries in Asia, and I would like you can choose. You can either say, yes, it's a democracy or not, yes or no, X or 0, or you can put it on a scale if that's what feels more comfortable to you, where 1 or 0 is not democracy and 10 is a perfect democracy. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or so to do this with the person sitting next to you. You don't have to get all the countries. I'm not going to collect it. There's no right, wrong answers. Just take a few minutes to kind of think about what democracy is and see if you could identify some democracies in Asia. You probably realized it's not that easy, right? It's not that easy. And especially if you try to rate countries. Is it a 9? Is it an 8? How do we compare democracies? So the job of a political scientist is not easy. What are some of the key characteristics that you guys looked for when you're thinking about looking for a democracy? What is democracy? Give me a couple. Anybody? How many people thought about elections? How many people thought about checks and balances? Checks on government power? People? How about free speech? Speech? Okay, great. Let's move on. So next I want to ask you what you think about democracy. So this now doesn't involve group discussion. This is just you thinking in your own head, okay? You're free, if you'd like to, I'm going to go through a series of questions, okay? And I want you to give it some thought. I'm probably going to skip a couple of them just because time is limited today. But you can look here and you can mark your answers here if you want to. You don't have to. And this is something that you can think about. So the first question I'd like you to think about is this. Which of the following statements do you most agree with? Okay, you pick one, the one you most agree with. First, democracy is always preferable to any other form of government. Your second choice, under some circumstances, an authoritarian government can be preferable to a democratic one. Or, third, for people like me, it does not matter whether we have a democratic or a non-democratic regime. Okay, the next one. Now I want you to think about your country, whatever country that is, you can define it, okay? Wherever you live or whatever you identify as your home, okay? And I would like you to first answer this question of how suitable do you think democracy is for your country? Okay. So 1 indicates democracy is unsuitable. It's not appropriate for my country. And 10 means it's entirely suitable. It fits my country. Okay? So that's the first one. And the second question is, how democratic do you believe your country is under the current regime, under the current government? How democratic is your country? You rank it from 1 to 10. Okay. We have some people visiting, I know from Thailand. That's a difficult one to think about. Is it a democracy right now or not? It had elections, but the military holds a large share of seats. So sometimes it's very difficult, and countries are in transition, and it's hard to know, right, at the time. So some countries it's quite easy, but some countries this can be quite difficult to figure out. Okay. The next set of questions, there's 4 sets. I'm just going to show you one of them, okay? But each of the 4 sets of questions on the back are exactly the same setup, okay? And in this case, it says many things may be desirable, but not all of them are essential characteristics of democracy. Okay, so all of these things might sound good to you. But I want you to think about which one of these 4 do you think is most essential characteristic of a democracy. Okay, so for example, for this one, you could choose government narrows the gap between the rich and the poor. Or people choose the government leaders in free and fair elections. Or government does not waste any public money. Or 4, people are free to express their political views openly. So you pick one of these that you think is the most essential characteristic of democracy. Okay, I'm going to skip the next 4, but you have them on your slides there. It's a similar set of questions, and you just pick one of them. Okay. So these questions that I just posed to you are often posed to citizens in different countries around the world in public opinion surveys. Okay? And so I'm now going to show you the reports from surveys of ordinary citizens living in East Asia when they were asked these same kinds of questions. Okay? The results, the survey that I'm going to tell you about comes from the Asia Barometer survey. And the Asia Barometer survey is hosted in Taipei, Taiwan. And it is a member of a group of global barometers. So there's a Euro barometer, an Afro barometer, a Latino barometer, okay, different barometers around the world. And this particular barometer focuses on Asia, and they survey individuals from 14 countries in East and Southeast Asia. And I'm going to present to you today some research that uses this Asian Barometer survey and analyzes the meaning of democracy for people in East Asia and the support for democracy among people in East Asia. So in this article, in this figure from this research, this was done in the Asia Barometer survey of Wave 2. So that was from 2005 to 2008. And here we see the demand for democracy and the supply for democracy. Demand is that question about suitable. Is democracy suitable for my country? That's plotted in the black bars. How democratic is my country? The supply of democracy in your country, how democratic you think your country is? That's the gray bar. Okay? Where's Japan here? One of the things we notice is, look, Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, notably some of the strongest democracies in Asia, have the lowest scores. It's interesting, right? And there is China and Japan, notably with very different political systems. And in China, there's higher support for democracy and higher demand for democracy. So this is kind of interesting. This is a table that I've taken from the Asia Barometer website on the meaning of democracy. Okay? And this is, remember the last question I posed to you, where you pick there's 4 different things, and you choose what's the most essential characteristic. Okay? So what this graph is showing is that the East Asian public has wide meanings of democracy. That is, democracy means things to different people. It means different things to different people. Different people can have their own ideas of democracy, right? And we don't all agree on what democracy means. So in this red bar here is good governance. So if you go back to the question, that's government does not waste any public money, okay? That was number 3 on that first question I gave, that of these 4. So government does not waste any public money. That's an example of good governance. Yellow is social equity. So that's government narrows the gap between the rich and the poor. Okay? The blue refers to norms and procedures of democracy. That would be people choose the government leaders in free and fair elections. And the top one in green is freedom and liberty. That would mean number 4. People are free to express their political views openly. So, as you can see, there's a wide range, and many people have different meanings that they associate with democracy. What's interesting is that a majority of the public focuses on good governance and social equity, right? At least 50% in all these countries, across all these countries. So Myanmar, Philippines, Cambodia, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Mongolia, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Japan. Across all of these countries, citizens focus on good governance and social equity. Who knows what political scientists focus on? The other 2. Political scientists define democracy by its norms and procedures, and in some cases by freedoms and liberties as well. So again, it's interesting to see the meaning of democracy varies among citizens, and it's different between citizens and political scientists. Oh, this was the slide that I was comparing it to. Okay. And to further emphasize that this difference between what political scientists think and what citizens think. So this is a plot, and the point of this plot is showing those who mistake their own authoritarian system for a democracy. Now, this was done in using the 4th wave of the Asia Barometer survey. So the surveys were administered between 2010 and 2012. During that time, all of these countries were considered dictatorships or authoritarian regimes by political scientists. And yet, large majorities in all of these countries claim that they live in a democracy. Okay? I'm not going to focus on the difference between the black and the white here. That's not so important. But what I want you to see is that high levels of support of people say that they live in a democracy. Okay? So most people in Singapore say they live in a democracy, but political scientists consider it not a democracy. Okay? So this research on the D word. First of all, this research points to a paradox. Citizens of Asian countries with authoritarian governments express stronger support for democracy than citizens of liberal democracies in Asia. Right? That was interesting. We saw that, for example, support was very high for democracy in China and lower in South Korea and Japan and Taiwan. Second, political scientists believe that this D word, this democracy word, has become a superficial term in the sense that it sounds good, everybody thinks democracy is good, and so if you say, is your country a democracy? Everybody says yes. That democracy has lost its meaning with a particular type of rule and instead means perhaps if you say your country is democratic, that means I support the government here. I believe that the government is legitimate and it has political authority. Okay? But it's lost its meaning So now political scientists try to ask questions about people's values and attitudes about democracy without ever saying the word democracy. So they don't say the D word. They ask them other things and try to avoid the D word in order to be able to assess their true support for democratic values and democratic rules. And last, research demonstrates divergent conceptions of democracy among political scientists and ordinary citizens. So now I want to turn to what is democracy according to political scientists. Okay? First of all, we live in a country, in a world today, where democracy is considered a good thing, as I was just saying. But it hasn't always been that way. So historically, democracy was considered dangerous and unstable. Now, political scientists going back to, Plato and Aristotle, they also thought about the relative merits of democracy or authoritarian, about different systems of government. Okay? And they debated about what would be the best form of government. But they didn't think that highly of democracy. For them, it was dangerous and unstable. It could lead to sort of the masses, the uneducated masses, ruling on behalf of themselves. Okay? Later, democracy really wasn't associated with elections or with representative government. I mean, people talked about elections and people talked about representative government, but those ideas weren't associated with democracy. Democracy was seen as something obsolete, an ancient political system that worked in Athens, but isn't for the world today. However, that changed in the 18th century and 19th century, and now here I'm going to present to you some modern views of democracy. So one of the modern political thinkers of democracy is Robert Dahl. And he was a professor at Yale University, and he thought that democracy as an ideal, no modern, large-scale country could really become a true democracy. Instead, he gave it a name called polyarchy, meaning rule of many, right? And he defined polyarchy as modern, large-scale, sort of representative democracy. Now, I think most people have accepted his ideas have been very influential, but his term, not so much. So political scientists still talk about democracy, and we don't talk about polyarchy that much. But his ideas were really influential. And he said we should focus on a procedural definition of democracy. We should focus on the norms and the procedures, not the outcomes. Democracy is defined by its rules and its procedures, and whether that produces a fair or non-corrupt or good quality government, that's a different question. Okay? Democracy should be defined by its rules and procedures, and he focused on two dimensions. One was about participation, which he called inclusion, and one was about contestation, competition. Okay? And he thought democracy needed to involve both of these. Everybody is included, and it's a competitive environment. Okay? People have a choice. So he drew a diagram that looked something like this. Okay, so on one dimension is inclusiveness, and on the other dimension is competition or contestation. So you could imagine, for example, let's see. So Japan today would be polyarchy, okay, up there where everybody can participate, even if they don't, in elections, and there's competition, even if the LDP usually wins. But let's see. Over here would be, say, the Soviet Union was a good example of everybody participated in elections, but there was only one choice, right? I think North Korea recently held elections, and the turnout rate was something like 99.7%, right? So full inclusiveness, but you had just one choice, okay? Not competitive. Up here might be cases like pre-apartheid South Africa, or early periods in the United States when African Americans couldn't vote. Okay, so there was competition among the white South Africans, but the majority of the population was excluded. Or you could think about countries before women were given the right to vote. Okay, they had competition among them, but 50% of the population was excluded from participating. Okay, so we have to have both these things, inclusion and competition, to get polyarchy. In his 1998 book, Dahl argues that large-scale democracy requires these 6 institutions. Okay, so large-scale democracy requires that you have elected officials, that you have free, fair, and frequent elections, that people have freedom of expression, that there's access to alternative sources of information. Why do you think he needs this? What does this mean? Access to alternative sources of information. Why is that important? Ideas? What do you think?
Easy manipulation of public opinion.
Yeah.
Easily could shut down something like who controls the public opinions and so on.
That's right. If all the information is coming from the government and supporting the incumbent government, then how can the opposition compete freely? The government might control the information and manipulate it in such a way. So we need access to alternative sources of information that isn't all controlled by the government. Right. Associational autonomy means that people can form groups that are independent from the state. So they can form political parties or trade unions or civil society organizations apart from that they're independent from government. And then inclusive citizenship, that most people residing in the country get to participate and run for office. So we have this abstract concept of democracy, but we also have to translate that into a practical sort of measurement of democracy. Okay, we need to be able to classify democracies. So how do we know a democracy when we see one? I tell you Singapore. How do you know? Does it go in the democracy box or the non-democracy box? Okay, what do you look for? So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how political scientists measure democracy. And when we talk about measuring democracy, we use this word operationalize, like we turn it into something we can use. We take our concepts and we turn them into something we can use. And I'm going to show you 4 different ways in which political scientists have operationalized democracy or measured democracy. Okay? So, and I'll go through each one of these. So the first one is called just democracy and dictatorship, or sometimes it's referred to as the DD measure. Okay? And this was put together by a set of political scientists from NYU. Okay? It's an academic group. And they were building on Dahl's idea of contestation. They left out the inclusion part because they were only focusing on 1945 to the present, in which case most democracies included everybody. Okay? So, setting that aside, they look at competition. And for them, democracy can be defined in a simple way. Democracy is a regime in which those who govern are selected through contested elections. Okay? That's it. Now, that's their definition. So how do they code countries as being democracy or not? The chief executive is elected, prime minister, president, okay? Whatever you call your prime minister or president, chancellor, whatever it might be, they're elected. The legislature is elected. There is more than one party competing in elections, and there has been an alternation in power under identical electoral rules. Why do they need this alternation in power? Okay. They need this 4th criteria because they want to be able to distinguish, for example, in Mexico for about, 6-7 decades, the Mexican held elections the Mexican government held elections every 6 years. Every 6 years there was a new president. Nobody could run more than once. And yet, every election, the PRI won. Okay? The government party always won. And compare that to Japan. Japan also held elections every set years, some post-World War II, up until 1993. No other party ever won. And take Botswana and Malaysia and Singapore. And there's all these countries where they hold elections, but we don't know, are they winning every time because the citizens support them? Or are they stuffing the ballot boxes? Or if they lost, they wouldn't give up power? Right? We don't know. It's hard to distinguish these. So what do these guys do? They basically look to see if there's been a change in power. And if there has, and the governing party gives up power to the opposition, then they say, okay, it's a democracy. And if it doesn't, they put it in the dictatorship pile. So their democracy group, they're pretty confident about. In the dictatorship group, they might have some countries that really are democracies, okay? So they might have some errors in the dictatorship group. But if you make it into the democracy group, we're pretty certain you're a democracy, okay? So that's their idea. And so they take also, what's interesting about theirs is they have what's called a dichotomous conceptualization. So just two choices. You're either a democracy or you're thrown in this other category. We'll call it dictatorship, but it's kind of the residual category. Everything else goes in there, okay? And so you're either yes or no, okay? Whereas Dahl, in his idea, sort of focused on this continual conceptualization, these, sort of spectrums of from more democratic to less democratic, okay? The second measure is sort of an academic and think tank kind of research-oriented group, and it's called Polity 4, and they envision a spectrum of governing authority. And so what they do is they code every country from, I think, 1800 to the present as being on a scale from 0 to 10 of how democratic they are, and a scale from 0 to 10 of how autocratic they are. And then you can subtract those two, and you get their polity score. So countries that have a 10 are perfect democracies, and countries that have a minus 10 are very strong authoritarian regimes. In between are somewhat mixed or weak governments, or governments that might be considered some kind of hybrid. Okay? Let's see. Their measure is kind of complicated. But they look at how competitive it is and who can become the chief executive. They look at checks and balances, constraints, like the judicial constraints on the executive. Can the president or prime minister or king do whatever they want? Or are there checks on their power, limits? They look at political participation and how competitive it is. And they weight these things differently. But when it comes down to it, what I want you to learn today is that they see democracy not sort of as a yes or no, but you can go on a scale. We have fully institutionalized democracies, and we have fully institutionalized autocracies, and then we have something that they call anocracies, but are basically mixed or incoherent authority regimes. And this is a graph from 1800 to 2016. So here's 1800, and here's 2016. And they're plotting democracies in blue and autocracies in red. Okay? And then these mixed countries in the middle. So we can see the history of democracy. This is considered the first wave of democracy, kind of slow, okay? And then there was a reverse wave, okay? After World War II, we get a second wave, and then we get sort of a reverse wave. And then the third wave of democracy comes in about 1980, starts in Southern Europe and Latin America. And then this dashed line, does anybody know what that would be? Yeah, fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, and we see a big spike in new democracies. Okay, and so we see the autocracies falling as well. And you can actually do this for different countries. So this is Japan's graph. It's kind of boring, right? Because it's just transition, and then it's solid 10, a democracy. But Thailand's gets much more interesting. Okay? So here we see ups and downs reflecting the switching back and forth from democracy to autocracy in Thailand. And the C's reflect military coups, and the X reflects a decline of democracy. All right, the third measure is from Freedom House. Now, Freedom House is not an academic organization. It's an NGO, and it's housed in the United States. And they actually don't measure democracy. They measure global freedom. But political scientists use this as a measure of democracy, often. Now, in contrast to all of the other scholars' works that I've been telling you about, this group of researchers they take a more widespread and substantive view of democracy. They don't just focus on the rules and the procedures. They also look at the outcomes of democracy. So let me give you an example, show you some examples. Okay, so they split freedom up into two categories, political rights and civil rights, or civil liberties. Okay? And then they code countries on these things, they classify them, and then they put it all together. In countries, they break them up into three groups: free, partly free, and not free. Okay? They've been doing this since 1972. Here's an example of the political rights questions. So they say, is the head of state elected in free and fair elections? Well, that's true in the DD measure, in polity, and according to Dahl, right? But they also say, is there pervasive corruption, right? So, or is there a competitive opposition? Do minorities have reasonable autonomy? Is the government accountable between elections? Is it open and transparent? So they're not just looking at the rules and the procedures, but they're also looking at the kind of governments that they produce, that these rules produce. And then for the civil liberties questions, is the media free and independent? Are there free religious organizations? Is there an independent judiciary? Is there equality of opportunity? Okay. Do citizens have the right to own property? So they're going beyond the rules and procedures to look at freedom of religion and other factors. And they produce a map every year. This is the map for 2019, which shows the results from 2018. And here we can see the green ones are free countries, the yellows are partly free, and the blues are not free. Okay? And Japan's over there in a green. And I pulled this is from their Freedom of the World from a couple of years ago. They didn't include it in this graph in their 2019 graph, but this shows the relationship between, just for Asia, and it shows the relationship between freedom, which is along here, okay, and wealth, GDP per capita. Okay? Now China's GDP is bigger than Japan's GDP, right? But China's GDP per capita, right, the population is also much bigger, right? And so GDP per capita, China looks poorer than it would if we just looked at GDP. Okay, so here's China, here's India. The size of the circle reflects the population. And what do we see? We see that in general, you know, the richest countries are democracies, but we also see poor democracies in Asia. And we see a wide range of freedom in this region, right? We have free countries, we have partly free countries, and we have not free countries. Okay, and the last one I'll tell you about is the Varieties of Democracy project. And this is a new approach that is created by political scientists, and it tries to take into account the complexity of democracy, that democracy might mean many things to many people, that scholars might disagree about the meaning of democracy, that there might be different types of democracy. And they try to measure so many different aspects of democracy. So it's multidimensional, it's disaggregated, and it acknowledges the complexity of democracy. This is a tremendous social science effort. It includes about 50 scholars in the designing of it, and over 3,000 scholars worldwide who help with the coding of different countries and different themes and different years. It's hosted now at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and they began collecting data in 2011. It now covers more than 200 countries and colonies from the past, from 1789 to the present. All the data was made public in 2016, so it's new, and they update it annually. So far, they've got 26 million plus data points. Okay? And some of these indicators in VDEM come from factual information, like when was the independence, and how many, what's the size of the population, facts. But other things require subjective evaluations. Is there pervasive corruption? Does the government harass journalists? How do you answer those questions? So they ask country experts, and they always have at least 5 experts. So they take into account the variation in experts, and they use fancy statistics to boil it all down. okay, and to make it comparable across different evaluators, across countries, across years. And they have 5 different types of democracies that they consider sort of core, though researchers could use their measures and develop their own other types of democracy. So electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberative, egalitarian. But the electoral one is considered fundamental, okay, to any other type. You have to have that, and then you can add on other things. And that electoral democracy is, here's how they define it, okay? The electoral principle of democracy seeks to achieve responsiveness and accountability between leaders and citizens through the mechanism of competitive elections. So it's a little bit more detailed than the early one, the DD measure I told you. Responsiveness and accountability. Responsiveness means that the government responds to the citizens' demands. If citizens' opinion changes, the government should change. Okay? And accountability means that if the government does not respond to citizens' demands, citizens can vote them out of office. Okay? They have a chance to hold government accountable. If the government's corrupt, then they can vote for somebody else. Okay? And this measure, electoral democracy, is designed precisely to measure those 6 institutions that Robert Dahl came up with. And so this variable they call polyarchy after Robert Dahl. Okay? And these were the 6 criteria that I told you about from Robert Dahl's book. Okay, elected officials, free, fair. So they set out to measure these exact criteria. Okay, and they create this electoral democracy index where they go through and they look clean elections, freedom of association, freedom of expression, alternative sources of information, what percent of the population can vote. And they put it all together in something called the Electoral Democracy Index. And here you can see Africa and Middle East, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Okay, and you can see you can see these dips, and this is from 1900 to 2010. Okay, so that's their electoral democracy index, and then this was specifically for Asia, and then they add on to it, and you could create the liberal democracy index, which I'm going to have to skip because of time, and they also produce a map. So for your homework, I want you to pick one of those countries on the table, okay? And I want you to visit Freedom House website or the VDEM website and look for the political rights score, the civil liberties, the electoral democracy, the liberal democracy. Look up the country that you're interested in and see how the ratings have changed over the last 10 years. Has it become more democratic or less? And how do they compare? Thank you very much. I'm sorry I ran a little bit out of time to cover everything, but I hope to see you in classes at Waseda in the future.